Hi everyone, this is Dr. Lay and I'm going to give you your instructions for blog post 1. To do this successfully, you have to pay careful attention to chapter 2 in John McWhorter's Words on the Move. Let's get started. So in this course, as you know, we're studying the Latin and Greek morphemes. Morphemes, as you will remember, are those basic parts of language. They're not necessarily words, although they can be words. Those bases, those prefixes and suffixes that in combination make up or constitute our current English vocabulary. But in addition to this, we are also studying the ways that words and their meanings are changing over time. So the subject then of blog post 1 is how that's happening in your lifetime. And I'd like you to showcase that by showing what you learned from reading this chapter. The title of the chapter is It's the Implication That Matters. To showcase what you've learned by reading this chapter closely, and also to share something about what you've seen in your witness in the way that the English language is moving, that is changing in your lifetime. So this blog post is text-based. You'll be using McWhorter, but you'll also be using your life and your lived experiences. We know that words change meanings all the time. You could probably, if we were meeting together, you would just start telling me words that are changing, that you're hearing that are uncommon to you. When you were a child, they meant one thing and that today they mean something else. Or reflections that people in your family, older members of your family have shared with you. And I could certainly share them, some of mine with you. But this change is actually very, very slow. Nonetheless, they are moving. So what I'm outlining here is some 8 main points from this chapter. I'm eclipsing some of the chapter because although it's interesting, it's not relevant to our study. And I'd like you to choose to reduce these 8 points down to 4 and then amplify them with your own experience, okay? And then that will result in your blog post of 500 words following MLA format. And you'll do this by midnight on Wednesday, March 11th. Point 1, this is from page 58. McWhorter writes, only in the 18th century did the word reduce come to mean what it does to us. Now, you remember we've already looked at the morpheme deuce or duke, D-U-C, which means to lead, right? And we talked about the word aqueduct, right? Duct means to lead and aqua means water. So an aqueduct means to lead water, right? And education, that's one of my go-to words, means to lead out. So when you are educated, you are led out of yourself. Reduce means to lead back. So actually, prior to the 18th century, reduce could mean to lead back to former glory, right? It didn't mean actually just to make smaller, right? It could actually mean to make bigger. Right, so McWhorter points out that in the 18th century, reduce had more than one meaning. But this meaning, he writes, it happened gradually as a result of the fact that words' meanings always have certain redundances beyond what we consciously consider. And so if you take something back to the way it was, that process will typically involve either improvement or ruin of some degree. So that's something to consider here. Point 1, does going back mean always something bad, something negative, or could it be something pejorative, or could it be something positive? Point 2, words do not sit still. One of the ways that words change is that they can shift from something very, very neutral to something extremely personal. And McWhorter points out here on page 59 that some words' meanings hold on longer than others, and some few hold on to the same meaning for thousands of years. So, for example, he uses the example of designations for members of our family. So, mother, father, brother, sister, these are terms that don't actually shift very much. Although most recently he uses the example of brother, that seems to have shifted in quite important ways. Brothers extending to other social meanings than just the familial meaning, right? Another thing that's interesting is the shift from the neutral to the personal. So, for example, a catch-all term, one that I'm thinking of that I can add to this is this word undertaker. So an undertaker used to be someone who just took on a task. And then it became very, very particularized, very personalized, one could say, to be someone who undertook to take care of the dead, right? So from the neutral to the personal. And that's consistent with what McWhorter says here in point 3. Words' meanings have either broadened or narrowed over time, and there are lateral shifts in meaning. So, for example, this broadening of brother to all mankind or all humankind, from my family member who is my immediate kin to all of my brothers, that's a broadening, right? Or this narrowing from an undertaker who is someone who is undertakes to do a task to someone who has a particular role in a particular facility, as in a funeral home or funeral parlor. But there are also lateral shifts in meaning, and that's in the conversation with this notion of the word meat, right? Where meat used to mean all food. We still have this hangover turn in sweet meats, right? All foods, but sweet foods. And then it came to mean just flesh.
For me, it's a cause of some upset that more Anglophones don't enjoy language. Music is enjoyable, it seems, so are dance and other athletic forms of movement. People seem to be able to find sensual and sensuous pleasure in almost anything but words these days. Words, it seems, belong to other people. Anyone who expresses themselves with originality, delight, and verbal freshness is more likely to be mocked, distrusted, or disliked than welcomed. The free and happy use of words appears to be considered elitist or pretentious. Sadly, desperately sadly, the only people who seem to bother with language in public today bother with it in quite the wrong way. They write letters to broadcasters and newspapers in which they are rude and haughty about other people's usage, and in which they show off their own superior knowledge of how language should be. I hate that, and I particularly hate the fact that so many of these pedants assume that I'm on their side. When asked to join in a "let's persuade this supermarket chain to get rid of their 5 items or less" sign, I never join in. Yes, I am aware of the technical distinction between less and fewer, and between uninterested and disinterested, and infer and imply, and all the rest of them, but none of these are of importance to me. None of these are of importance, I said there. You'll notice the old pedantic me would have insisted on none of them is of importance. But I'm glad to say I've outgrown that silly approach to language. Oscar Wilde, and there have been few greater and more complete lords of language in the past 1,000 years, once included with a manuscript he was delivering to his publishers a compliment slip in which he had scribbled the injunction, "I'll leave you to tidy up the woulds and shoulds, wills and shalls, that's and whiches, etc." Which gives us all encouragement to feel less guilty, don't you think? There are all kinds of pedants around with more time to read and imitate Lynn Truss and John Humphreys than to write poems, love letters, novels, and stories, it seems. They whip out their sharpies and take away and add apostrophes from public signs, shake their heads at prepositions which end sentences, and mutter at split infinitives and misspellings. But do they bubble and froth and slobber and cream with joy at language? Do they ever let the tripping of the tips of their tongues against the tops of their teeth transport them to giddy euphoric bliss? Do they ever yoke impossible words together for the sound sex of it? Do they use language to seduce, charm, excite, please, affirm, and tickle those they talk to? Do they? I doubt it. They're too farting busy sneering at a greengrocer's less than perfect use of the apostrophe. Well, sod them to Hades. They think they're guardians of language. They're no more guardians of language than the Kennel Club is the guardian of dog kind. And the worst of this sorry bunch of semi-educated losers are those who seem to glory in being irritated by nouns becoming verbs. How dense and deft a language development do you have to be? If you don't like nouns becoming verbs, then for heaven's sake avoid Shakespeare, who made a doing word out of a thing word every chance he got. He tabled the motion and chaired the meeting in which nouns were made verbs. I suppose new examples from our time might take some getting used to. He actioned it that day, for instance, might strike some as a verbing too far, but we've been sanctioning, envisioning, propositioning, and stationing for a long time, so why not actioning? Because it's ugly, whinge the pedants. Well, it's only ugly because it's new and you don't like it. Ugly in the way Picasso, Stravinsky, and Eliot were once thought ugly, and before them Monet, Mahler, and Baudelaire. Pedants will also claim, with what I'm sure is eye-popping insincerity and shameless disingenuousness, that their fight is only for clarity. Well, this is all very well, but there's no doubt what, for example, 5 items or less means. Just as only a dolt can't tell from the context and from the age and education of the speaker whether disinterested is used in the proper sense of non-partisan or in the improper sense of uninterested. No, the claim to be defending language for the sake of clarity almost never ever holds water, nor does the idea that following grammatical rules in language demonstrates clarity of thought and intelligence of mind. Having said this, I admit that if you want to communicate well for the sake of passing an exam or job interview, then it's obvious that wildly original and excessively heterodox language could land you in the soup. I think what offends examiners and employers when confronted with extremely informal, unpunctuated, and haywire language is the implication of not caring that underlies it. You slip into a suit for an interview and you dress your language up too. You can wear what you like linguistically or sartorially when you're at home or with friends, but most people accept the need to smarten up under some circumstances. It's only considerate. But that's an issue of fitness, of suitability. It has nothing to do with correctness. There's no right language or wrong language any more than there are right or wrong clothes. Context, convention, and circumstance are all. I can't deny that a small part of me still clings to a ghastly Radio 4 newspaper letter writer pedantry, but I fight against it in much the same way I try to fight against my gluttony, anger, selfishness, and other vices. I must confess, for example, that I find it hard.
So it's not just fashionable to transform verbs into nouns or nouns into verbs. Currently, it's always been the case. English has this incredible capacity to change and to move. Point 7. We also, I'm going to talk a lot about this, but this longer point comes actually from Steven Pinker, and John McWhorter has co-opted it for his purposes. Euphemisms, those are terms that we use to sort of soften the blow of bad news. For example, instead of saying that someone died, we say that they passed away. Or perhaps you've heard other terms. Well, pass away seems a little bit upsetting. Maybe we can soften it another way. And so you get on what Pinker calls the euphemism treadmill, and you keep replacing it with other terms, and they go sour. So pass away to kick the bucket, or and they get worse and worse. And so this is what he's talking about when he says these terms naturally become accreted with really disastrous effects, and so that's why they need constant replacements. That's point 7, and he has a really interesting section in there in the text, which you might want to take a look at if you're interested. Point 8, which is where we started, a word is a thing on the move. So this is what we're studying this semester, right? Is the way that words move, and the way that we're combining and recombining. And English has a particular relationship and acceptance of this kind of movement, and I'll be talking more about that as we continue the semester. So I am looking forward to reading your blog post 1. Write about 500 words. Use 4 of these samples. Use your own experiences. That's really important to me. Write naturally, but write correctly. And your blogs are listed on the blog roll, so check out what each other is writing, right? And make sure that you email me with your questions. You can see my email there. My email is also on the blog. Get to work. Thanks.